Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm Dean of the College of Environmental Design. Along with my colleagues Carla Hesse, Dean of the Social Sciences, and Christopher Edley, Dean of the Berkeley Law School, I want to welcome you all to the first campus forum on the future of public universities. This forum, and 3 others that are to follow later this year, are an initiative of the deans of UC Berkeley, who, with one voice, strive to engage the campus community in a rigorous interrogation of the complex challenges facing public universities, including our own, and to work collectively to develop thoughtful and effective pathways forward. Before we begin, Carla, Chris, and I want to thank all the people and organizations that have made this event possible. In particular, we want to thank Penny Ismay, who has been our coordinator extraordinaire and in a very short time brilliantly managed the many organizational demands of holding this forum. We're also very grateful to the campus organizations and leaders who engaged us in conversation about this series of forums and lent their support to our efforts. And these organizations include the ASUC, Associated Students of University of California, the Berkeley Staff Assembly, the Graduate Assembly, the Academic Senate. And we're also very grateful to the support of the Office of the Chancellor and our Chancellor, Robert Bergeneau, and George Breslauer, our Executive Chancellor and Vice Provost. Through this forum and the 3 that follow, we want to convey to students, faculty, and staff the complex challenges that we face as our state and our nation progressively disinvest in public higher education. As I said, all 3 deans here today represent all of the deans of Berkeley, our academic colleges and professional schools, in a unanimous commitment to providing informed leadership as we chart our way forward. The concrete goal that we've set for ourselves is to find ways forward that make it possible to deal with the enormous financial challenges that we face while maintaining the profoundly public character of this institution and its commitment to providing world-class educational opportunities. And these are opportunities that have dramatically enriched the lives of our alumni and created pathways to social mobility for so many generations of Californians. This is why we chose the topic of social inequality and social opportunity as our first forum, because the role of public university education as a pathway to upward mobility is of critical concern, not only to the character of our own university, but also to the nation at large. We think it's especially important for everyone to understand how access to higher education and ultimately the life chances of many Americans will be impacted as not only the financial model for public universities is restructured, but also as the demographics of our state and nation shift and new kinds of socioeconomic inequalities emerge. Today, we're here to talk about 4 interwoven themes, and they are, first, how public higher education has historically impacted the creation of opportunity and social mobility, how changing demographics, racial politics, immigration, and the economy affect the provision of collective goods and opportunities for social mobility, how access to public universities impacts the pursuit of social justice, and how questions of access to higher education affect the health of our democracy and our economy. I think it's important to ask what is at stake in these questions. And I think the answer for me is straightforward. It is nothing more than or less than the master plan for public universities in the state of California. Most of you know that our 3-tiered system of community colleges, state universities, and the UC campuses combine to provide not just access or excellence, but access to excellence. The master plan and the values that it represents has been perhaps the most powerful model for public higher education in the world. Yet today it is at risk and I think needs to be defended in a thoughtful but forceful way. Therefore, it's inspiring to see everyone here today and heartening because it will truly take a united effort of all the great minds of the universities, the university here, our faculty, staff, and of course students, to chart a way forward. So we're looking forward to this discussion and to what may follow. I'd like now to turn the podium over to Carla Hesse, who will talk to you about how we will organize the questions for this day's forum. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and again, welcome. The format for today will be that each speaker will speak for roughly 15 to 20 minutes. At the end of their speeches, there will be people coming through the aisles with note cards that they're going to be distributing, or hopefully you've gotten them at the door with pencils available. And we will be collecting those cards. Dean Edley and myself will be sorting through those cards, and we will prepare them to be posed to the speakers at the end of the entire set of speeches. We've allocated ample time for that. We want you to get your questions answered. The quality of your questions is the critical element in the success of this event, so we hope that you'll devote some thought to that as you're going forward. The questions we pose will be yours, not ours. Our role as deans here is to moderate and to facilitate this event. So please, if you need a note card, just show your hand. We have a fantastic group of volunteers from both the student body and from the staff who are at your service. Again, thank you for getting involved in this event. The first speaker today is well known to many on campus, Peter Schrag. He's a former editor and columnist for the Sacramento Bee, as well as having contributed to many major newspapers and magazines nationwide. This year, I believe, or is it just this semester, he's also a visiting scholar at Berkeley's Institute for Governmental Studies, where he's focusing on issues of immigration, and education. Peter Schrag is also the author of numerous books. I'm only going to mention a couple of them, but I hope that after his remarks you'll want to go out and read in greater depth and appreciate the depth of his reflection on many of the issues that we're facing today. Most recently, a book called Not Fit for Our Society, Immigration and Nativism in America, which was published by the University of California Press. Paradise Lost, California's Experience, America's Future, which was updated with a new preface just recently. And The Final Test, The Battle for Adequacy in American Schools. It is a great privilege and a pleasure to welcome him to the podium today, and I'll look forward to his remarks.
It's a great privilege and honor to be here and to be invited to speak with this distinguished panel. All my life, I've looked for an opportunity to talk back to a lot of deans, and I finally got it. I should say, by the way, that for much of my life, much of my career, I've been an editorial writer and a newspaper columnist, and there's an old saying in our profession, our shrinking profession, that when the battle is over, the editorial writers ride out of the hills and shoot the wounded. Anyway, I'm here avocationally, not professionally, and I try not to shoot any wounded. In any case, the subject today is something that much of which is familiar to many people in this room, and that is essentially the declining commitment of societies in general and the state of California in particular to public services. And when we talk about higher education, we have to keep in mind the larger context, which is that everything is being stiffed these days. K-12 education, the roads, the water systems, the parks, all of which were models for the nation half a century ago. We were the exemplar with the master plan, with our parks, with our highways, with our freeways for the nation and for much of the world. I won't go into detail on any of that. I don't have time for it. But right now, just to use one example, we are something around 46th in the nation in what we spend per pupil in our public schools, We're 50th in students per teacher. We're 49th in students per librarian, 49th in students per counselor, and 46th in students per administrator. So we are where we were once an example and for the world, we are now an example of a different sort. Anyway, let's get right to the subject at hand, which is higher education. About 20 years ago, Pat Callan, who was then just beginning as the director of the Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, observed that just as a new generation of students was getting ready for college, public support for colleges was going down. And what he was referring to particularly, of course, was what Clark Kerr called tidal wave 2. What nobody said at the time, of course, is that tidal wave 2 would be overwhelmingly composed of minorities, of Latinos, of Asians, of African Americans. And anyway, what Callan was saying was just as tidal wave 2, as this new generation was arriving, public support was going down. Now, the question here is that and was that just a coincidence? And it seems to me it's an important question to ask. There's lots of worry around the state about, and again, recently a bill was introduced and not passed about trying to restore some form of affirmative action and relating affirmative action to university access. But I think much more concern in California and nationally is the fact that our K-12 schools and our community colleges are already overwhelmingly majority minority. And in our community colleges, less than a third of the 1.7 million full-time equivalent students are now non-Hispanic whites. At UC, just in the past 35 years, there's been an enormous decline in white attendance. In 1976, 67% of UC enrollment was white. Currently, it's about 33%, just half that. And while we worry about not having enough Latinos, the percentage of Latinos has gone up from something like 4% to 15%. Not great, but it tells you something about the changing population. And when we talk about Asians, in 1976, 7% of UC enrollment was Asians. In 2010, it was 30%, more than 4 times that number. So we have almost as many Asian students in UC generally as we have non-Hispanic whites. I'm telling you this not as to explain a problem or an achievement or lack of an achievement. I'm just telling you that that the change in those populations may have a lot to do with the public willingness or unwillingness to support the institutions as generously as they were supported in what we regard as the good old days. As I say, you can celebrate that diversity, and we should, or we can regret that it's inadequate, but it may have an enormous impact on public support. We have California now has a majority-minority population. We're 42% white, 37% Hispanic. But voters in last year were still 63% white and 18% Latino. So there's a great gap, great disproportion between the electorate and the population, and particularly the population of our schools and universities. And there's some research that indicates that points to that there is a link, and it's a strong link. Research both in Europe and to some extent in this country by Alberto Alessino of Harvard, of Peter Lindert, now retired at UC Davis, that there is an inverse relationship between diversity of a population and the willingness of the voters to support generous public goods. As Peter Lindert says, when the beneficiaries of something could be your sister or your son or your brother, you're more likely to support it than if it's another. And in California or nationally as well, if you think that not only are they others, but that they may be here without documentation, that creates even more resentment. And those of us in journalism who have written about crowded schools and tight budgets get incessant emails, and before that, regular mail from readers saying, if it wasn't for those, I'll be damned if I'm going to spend another dime in additional taxes for those people. But I think also, I think we're also to some extent in higher education the victims of our own success. We celebrate the master plan as we should, the 1960 master plan, which was basically a division of turf between the three segments of the system and a guarantee to all students who could take advantage of one of those segments that they could go there at little or no cost. That was great then and is great as a principle, but it also leaves us with some problems. One is that we are maybe too much stuck with the three silos that are still independent and separate and don't connect nearly as much as they should. And again, as we fuss about affirmative action, we should not forget that 3/4 of our college students these days are in the community colleges, and which, as I said, are now majority minority, and that's where the largest share of our concern, I think, should be. In California, more than 70% of African American students and 70% of Latinos are enrolled in community colleges. And I think one of the ongoing travesties of our system is the low completion rate in the community colleges. And I'm talking about completion transfer rates, degrees awarded, all of them combined. After 6 years, 70% of community college students don't complete a degree or a transfer or finish a vocational program. Among blacks, it's 75%. Among Latinos, it's 80%. Now, granted, a great many community college students don't set out for a degree or to get a transfer. They come for a course or two to complete some vocational qualifications, but a great many of them do and don't finish. And part of the reason for that is that in California, I think more so than in many other states, we still have financial policies set by the legislature that rewards attendance rather than completion, so that there is more of an incentive in those schools, in those colleges, to keep bodies in the classroom rather than making sure they succeed. That's beginning to change, but it hasn't changed nearly enough. I think another problem may be, and this is partly a financial problem, is that we may be, in fact, charging too little tuition in the community colleges, when our community colleges charge roughly half the national average, less than those in any other state, now currently $36 a unit, $1,080 for a year. The legislative analyst says we could easily charge $60 a unit, and it would not affect access very much, because most low-income students get waivers, get tuition waivers, in addition to which we could then, those students could then capture a great deal more in federal financial aid and in fact in tax and tax reductions which they're now, or their parents are not now eligible for. Anyway, and it may be that low tuition is also a disincentive to completion, and that's a long argument that you can get lots of different viewpoints about, and I won't go into it, but it's something that I think is worth considering. We're making some progress on community college completion. A bill was passed about a year ago that would essentially require or encourage the CSU, California State University, and the community colleges to work more closely together in developing common courses for lower division courses so that transfers would be guaranteed, would be easier. The legislature can't compel UC to do that, and UC in general, with some major exceptions, is still pretty much stuck in its own silo, and in being unwilling to create the transfer options and the guarantee of common courses, the common course requirements, so that when a student takes a particular course in math or in physics or in chemistry, he will get credit for that course if he tries to transfer to a UC. And then, in addition, there's a task force report that is also trying to lay groundwork for more transfers. And again, again, let me re-emphasize, this is a very serious problem. California, in California particularly, the present generation of people 55 to 64 has a much higher level of degree completion than those in the ages of 25 to 34. So in fact, we are losing ground, not only losing ground compared to what we were, but losing ground to a whole lot of other places, other states, and other countries, where completion rates are now much higher than ours. I think the United States is now 10th in college completion among OECD countries. So we have a great many things that are challenging us, and obviously, and the reasons obviously why we have to get out of this bind are pretty obvious. We're not replacing the baby boomers who are now retiring or about to retire, and which is going to be an absolute necessity in the coming generation. We may come to realize that sooner or later that the voters will come to realize that the economy depends on it. And as Dowell Myers, who is a very wise demographer at USC, has pointed out, who will buy the houses of the homes of the baby boomers when they retire? And the only people who are going to be around to do that are going to be immigrants and the children of immigrants. I shouldn't say the only people, but the great majority of people. So will the electorate catch on soon enough? And I think I better leave it here. I should only leave it with one other thought, and that is, and I think we have to keep this in mind, because I don't want to be a total downer, and that is that what we're trying to do in California particularly is something which is to bring this great diversity of people to a high level of education, to a high level of achievements, and to generate a good, successful society is something that's really never been done or tried anywhere else. We are ahead of the world, we're ahead of the country in trying to integrate immigrants, to accommodate immigrants and their children, in accommodating this great diversity of people, ethnicities, cultures, languages, and all the rest. And I think if we succeed, we will have set a really shining example for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and I'd now like to invite Chris Edley up to introduce our next speaker.
Well, is it okay if I do it from here?
You can do it.
Okay, great, because I'm incredibly lazy. The word that I associate with Bob Reich is singular. Singular. He is not only extraordinarily prolific. By my calculation, he produces a book about every 18 months when not serving as a cabinet officer. But not just prolific, but influential. There is simply no more influential voice in public discourse, in my judgment, on issues of economic justice, change, wealth, poverty. He's the man. Singular, there is no faculty member at UC Berkeley whose courses are in more demand among our undergraduates than Bob Reich. Singular because he has an ability to serve while being self-conscious about where the ship is headed and if it's headed in the wrong direction. Even if it wins him foes in high places, detractors in high places. So that's about enough to say about him. My dear friend of 30 years. Well, I should add that I am next week going to be announcing the formation of the Bob Reich for Governor Committee. Because I think that, now just to be clear, I don't want him to win, because I would hate for Berkeley to lose him. But I can think of no better way to make sure that the right set of values and the right set of issues are front and center in the debate about moving our society forward. So with that, Robert Reich.
Go over there?
Stop giving me those dirty looks.
I think this is an OSHA violation. Chris, thank you for those very, very kind and completely inaccurate words. And I've already run for governor once, so forget it, in a different state. Let me suggest to you the parameters of a problem in slightly different ways than Peter Schrag. And Peter, thank you for that elegant presentation, even if it was a little bit downbeat. As far as I took away from Peter, one of the problems is that we are becoming so diverse, both as a state and also as a country, that diversity itself is a threat to public provision in terms of the political will to provide for the public. And I'm sure there is an element, in fact, I know that there is a large element of truth to that. But what I want to suggest to you is that there's something else going on. If you look back on Proposition 13, or in my home state, Proposition 2.5, or many of the tax revolts that thundered across America, what you see is that they all took place starting in the late 1970s. Now, what do we know about the late 1970s? What do we know, indeed, about the last 35 years? In contrast to the 3 decades after the Second World War, we know that something quite profound changed. In the 3 decades after the Second World War, as the United States economy grew, almost doubled in size, and as productivity increases were quite dramatic, everybody, whether you were rich or you were poor or you were middle class or working class, your incomes increased in tandem. In fact, we became a more equal society in terms of the gap between the rich and poor, and it was possible for almost everybody in our society to realistically expect equal opportunity. And to the extent that we didn't have equal opportunity, we fought for it in the form of civil rights and voting rights and anti-discrimination legislation. What happened in the late 70s was that that story changed. It changed partly because new technologies came on stream. Container ships, satellite communication technologies, cargo ships, all sorts of things that enabled the production process to be parceled out around the world where various aspects of it could be done much more cheaply. And also new automated technologies, which eventually became digital and computer technologies, allowing many jobs that were not sent abroad, but were still routine jobs, to be done by software, by robotics, by numerically controlled machine tools. The result was that by the late 1970s, even though the American economy continued to grow, even though productivity continued to gain at approximately the same rate as the first 3 decades after the Second World War, the median wage, instead of increasing in tandem with the growth of the economy, the median wage, and when I say median, you understand, I'm not talking about average. The Commerce Department puts out data on average wages. The median is different. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have a median height of 5'5" and an average height of 6'5". You see, the people at the top bring up the average. The median is what we really need to talk about if we're really talking about the middle class and everybody below. Median wages, beginning in the late 1970s, began to level out. And eventually, in 2001, adjusted for inflation, began to drop. It's not, in my view, the matter that the American public became less generous or necessarily more intimidated by diversity. It's that when your wages are flattening or declining, and many of your expenses continue to rise, you become less generous. You don't want to pay more taxes because you cannot afford to. The great American middle class did whatever it could to maintain its living standards in light of globalization and technological change. Women flooded into the workforce, women with young children, not because of wonderful professional opportunities for women, but because they had to in order to prop up declining male wages. Everyone worked longer hours. By the 1990s, the typical American was working overtime and also billable hours, if a professional, 50, 60, 70 hours a week on average. And then finally, when those two coping mechanisms were exhausted, people turned to a third, and that is going into debt, deeper and deeper into debt, using their homes as collateral for refinancing and home equity loans. But all that time, the tensions continue to grow. Where did all the money go, by the way? Because I said to you a moment ago that the American economy continued to grow, productivity continued to gain, the median wage stagnated and eventually declined, but where did the money go? Class. 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 You see, that's the problem. Because when you talk about this, people accuse you of being a class warrior. I'm not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. It's not anybody's fault that the top 1% went from taking in around 9% of total national income in the 1970s to, by 2007, 23.5% of total national income. But you see, with that degree of income, and wealth, by the way, went from, in the 1970s, about 18%, although much more difficult to measure. The measurements of wealth are far less reliable than our measurements of income, but roughly 18% of total national wealth in the top 1%, to today about 38% of total national wealth. Today, the top 400 families in America earn on average $300 million each. Together, the top 400 families have more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans put together. This is a very rich nation. We are richer by far than we've ever been before. The question is what we're investing in, what we're doing with our wealth and our income. The answer to globalization and technological change that hit us with great force beginning in the late 1970s, the real answer was to invest even more and even better in education, was to invest in early childhood education, to expand and improve the quality of K through 12 education, and to make higher education even more readily affordable and available. But you see the great irony, the great paradox, because as the middle class lost the capacity to pay more in taxes, that meant that many public provisions, including education, began to lose their quality, because those who had greater and greater wealth and income in society did not want to pay more. And as the quality of schools deteriorated, and the quality of many other public provisions deteriorated, it was almost natural and inevitable that the upper middle class and others would secede from the commons. And that secession itself into private provision, private schools, or what are the equivalent of private K through 12 schools, public schools in wealthy communities, where you can only get to those private schools by buying into those wealthy communities, or all sorts of other private provisions. We now have more private security guards in America than public police officers, and so on. As the middle class, the upper middle class, lost faith in the quality of public provision, it was almost inevitable that we would see the beginnings of a vicious cycle in which there was less and less political support for those public common goods. And as they deteriorated, less and less political support, again coming from the upper middle class and the wealthy. Now, let me just say something about California, because I'm a newcomer here. I came here because I, like most people in the East, couldn't stand the weather anymore. I also loved something about California: its experimentalism, its diversity, its willingness to change. I always did. Came out here 6 years ago, and I haven't been disappointed. Although I have to tell you, I bought a house out here at the very peak of the housing bubble. I now, through my property tax payments, subsidize most of my neighbors in a very big and important way. But what has struck me since I've been here is several simultaneous failures, and I'm puzzled by them. I can understand them, but I'm puzzled by them. One failure is the business community. California is the world's leader in technology. It's the world leader in venture capital. It's the world leader in entertainment. You name a major complex industry in the world that is developing and innovating as fast as these industries in California, well, it's very difficult to do. And yet, I'm troubled, surprised, and sort of amazed at the silence of these communities in the face of our declining educational system. Now, it's true they can get talent from all over the world, and they do. But they are at least dependent to a large extent on both the talent, the infrastructure, and the social capital of California. I would have expected, and still do expect in my good days, that business leaders will rise to the occasion. Secondly, more provincially, there are alumni. The University of California has some of the most influential alumni all through this state. Unfortunately, many of them are under the illusion that the University of California is still primarily financed by their taxes. I am surprised and a little bit concerned and worried that they are and continue to be under that illusion. I think they should also, the graduates, the alumni of the University of California, rise to the occasion. I think finally it is very important for all of us to rise to the occasion. Because I am rather conspicuous in terms of my height, and people know me, when I go out in the world, as I often do in public places, in airports and elsewhere, people come up to me, people I don't know, and they complain. Isn't it awful? Can you imagine? Can it possibly get worse? After days and days of this, I can get fairly depressed. But I've taken upon myself a new technique. When the whiners and kvetchers attack me, as they do, I say back to them, what are you doing about it? What are you doing? Let's have enough, we've had enough whining. What steps are you taking? Are you mobilizing? Are you energizing? Are you organizing? What are you doing about this situation? In a global high-tech economy, higher education is not a private investment. It is a public good. We are all beneficiaries. The more Californians, the more Americans are more proficient, more productive, more innovative, more capable of generating higher and higher value. We are all to the worse, to the extent that the budget for prisons exceeds the budget for higher education. We do not have to tolerate this. We don't have to all run for office. But we do have to let our voices be heard loudly. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. It's now my pleasure to introduce our third and final speaker, Angela Glover-Blackwell. Angela is the founder and the CEO of PolicyLink, a national research and action institute advancing social and economic equality and equity. She's a widely recognized national leader on issues of poverty, race, and social justice, and her work seeks to strengthen America's communities by creating stronger, low-income communities and communities of color. A former senior vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation, she appears regularly in the national and local media and writes for other media print media outlets. And she is also the co-author of a fabulous book called Uncommon Common Ground, Race and America's Future. It's now in its second printing. Please join me in welcoming Angela Glover Blackwell.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm so oh, please stop saying that. It's my command. I'm delighted to be here and delighted that you're having this conversation because it is such an important conversation. We have been so lucky as a nation and as a state because even as we haven't always done the right thing, something has happened to provide an opportunity and a pathway. And so I want to talk to you about the newest gift that's come to this nation and how this nation has an opportunity to take a path that could really build a fully inclusive society in which all can participate and prosper. California is a place that has been attractive for a long time. I didn't grow up in California either. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. And I didn't come to California until I married and came out here. But I can remember as a little girl, whenever anybody from St. Louis moved to California, those of us who were left behind had great envy. We thought that they were going to the promised land. And it's interesting when you think about California right after World War II. What existed in terms of the population was a population that had a lot of challenges. Half the people were new arrivals, a quarter of them were living below the poverty level, half did not have a high school diploma. But California viewed those people, who were overwhelmingly white, as an asset deserving of investment. And it created the best K-12 system, the best community college through higher education system, best healthcare system, the best of so much. So that in 1962, Newsweek talked about California, the #1 state, booming, beautiful California. California could do that again, and California could be a model for the nation that needs to figure out how to step up. Because we're coming out of a period that was just described by previous speakers, is one in which we had invested in a growth model that was a failed growth model. We invested in a growth model that was based on a housing bubble, fueled by credit driving all the consumption, a period of financial deregulation, and we created a model in which a few were able to benefit, but most were not. We ended up with lost wealth. We ended up with fewer jobs, jobs that were not paying as much, extremely high unemployment, and the destruction of the safety net all at the same time. We clearly need a new growth model. It needs to be one that is sustainable. It needs to be one that is inclusive. It needs to be one that prepares us for the future. And the gift that I want to talk to you about is the population that is going to be the future. The demographic shift in this nation is a reality, but it's not a problem. It is not a problem. It has within it all the elements that this country needs, not just to do okay, but to become the world leader that it once was. Too many look around today and feel terrible about what's going on and find themselves feeling nostalgic for back in the day. I would say that people are being nostalgic for a time that never was. It wasn't that good when the only people who were getting access to higher education were people who were white or people who were connected, and so many Latinos and others were in the fields picking fruits and vegetables, excluded. It wasn't that good when so many young people who were Asian were in sweatshops, excluded from access to the higher education that they could have benefited from. It wasn't that good when so many African American young men and women were in the back of the room or on the street corner or forgotten altogether. Nostalgic for a time that never was. It wasn't inclusive. But at the same time that this nostalgia is going on, we are ignoring a future that is inevitable, trying to run away from a future that is inevitable. Because we are becoming a nation in which the majority of people are people of color. This is not a bad thing. This is going to be a good thing. It's going to be just what the nation needs at this moment. And it's coming faster than most thought. By the end of this decade, we will be a nation in which the majority of those under 18 are children of color. By 2030, we will be a nation in which the majority of young workers are of color. And by 2042, we will be a nation in which the majority of people are of color. We have the capacity to be able to look forward and say, what do we need? And look within our midst and see that if we invest in those who are here, we will have it. The thing that has made this nation strong and the envy of the world has been the middle class. It absolutely has been the middle class. You pick whatever your poor country, your favorite poor country might be, and what makes that country poor is not the absence of rich people. It's not the absence of rich people. All the poor countries have rich people. It's the absence of a middle class. They have rich people and poor people. We're becoming that nation if we don't do something about being able to preserve and invest in a middle class. We know who the people are who could be the middle class. We know where they are. We know what they need. We know how to be able to get them ready if we could just make the commitment to invest in them. We know that in order to be competitive in the global economy, we have to become innovators again. We have to become producers again. We have to have a vibrant economy that's really focused on what the needs are going to be going forward. We're not going to be that if we don't invest in the people who could be the innovators, in the people who could be the workforce, if we don't really help to build the entrepreneurial spirit among the people who are just bursting with entrepreneurial ideas and energy. When Manuel Pastor and I and Stuart Quo did the book Uncommon Common Ground, one of the things that we talked about is the most entrepreneurial activity is actually coming out of Latino, Asian, and African American communities disproportionately. They are trying to start businesses and move forward. They need to have support. That we know that as we look forward and we think about this democracy and how to preserve the democracy and how to really show that the democracy is a system that can help the world going forward, we have the possibility to show that democracy is not something that only works in an environment in which everybody is the same. But to be able to have a vibrant democracy in a truly diverse environment is a democracy worth crowing about. All of a sudden, we have a democracy that really is able to deal with the challenges effectively and inclusively. And as we think about climate change and what we need to do as a nation to be a leader there, we know that there are a couple of things that we absolutely have to do. We have to get people out of their cars and using public transportation. And I say to you, that's never going to happen at the level that it needs to if we don't get comfortable sitting next to the other. We have to, if we're going to deal with climate change, make sure that we're really focusing on those parts of the community that are huge contributors in terms of old building, old housing stock, old office buildings. We have to invest in rehabilitating, revitalizing our older communities. We have to retrofit those communities. That turns out to be the same agenda that low-income people of color have been asking for decades, to do something about the places where they live. And so as we look forward, we can see our future. It's a 7-year-old Latina. It's a 12-year-old black boy. It's a 17-year-old Asian girl. And we know where they are, what they need, and what the investments have to be. And if we do it, we become a world nation. We become a world nation that can interact with the world, that can help to be a leader on the world platform. If we do it, we actually do something about the demographic shift. And the demographic shift that ought to be most worrying in this country is not becoming a nation in which we have the majority people of color, but a nation that is old. A nation that is old and in need of people who are young, to be able to keep things going, to keep things moving forward. And we have young people who are here and who want to be part of it. And so as we think about how to go forward and think about the role of public institutions, there really is perfect alignment. One of the things we need first and foremost from our important public institutions, public universities, places like this place where we sit, is voice. We need for people to actually speak out, begin to tell the people of California and the American people that there is a path forward and why it is that we have to take the path that is right there in front of us. We need for the university to really understand that what we need more than anything else going forward is we need leaders, leaders who are educated, leaders who understand complex problems, leaders who operate outside of silos because they've never really seen any value in operating within them. The university is the place to train those leaders to be able to both be champions for the way forward, but understand the way forward. We need institutions that understand that everything they do has to be able to contribute to building a more inclusive society. I love a model that I've recently been studying in Cleveland called the Evergreen Cooperative. It's something developed by the Democracy Collaborative, and what they've done is working with anchor institutions. They have been able to build businesses in which people who are many recently returning from prisons, people who are low income, actually become owners of businesses going forward. They have two going already. One is a laundry business that's cleaning the sheets and the things from the local hospitals, and the other is a greenhouse that's actually at a very large scale providing fresh fruits and vegetables to hospitals and schools and other places. Anchor institutions are utilizing this worker-owned business, and the cooperative business is actually building wealth and entrepreneurial activity in the community, everything fitting together. We have to understand as public institutions that everything we do is an opportunity to build a more inclusive society. As we think about the future, and what the workforce is going to be about, we need our institutions of higher education more than ever to have linkages and commitment to make sure that everybody is able to participate and prosper. The growth in jobs has been uneven. We've had a 20% growth in high-wage jobs, a 31% growth in low-wage jobs, and a 3% growth in the middle-wage jobs. So that if you are not educated and able to move into a higher wage job, you are not really ready to be able to make it in this society. Still, the majority of jobs are in that middle wage group, and we need to make sure that we're feeding people there. But the low wage industry, not only are the wages low, but there are no pathways to opportunity from those jobs. And we have to really figure out how to make sure that elementary schools, high schools, community colleges, right up through higher education are taking the reality of what the future is going to be with work and making sure that people are trained for it. And so my message, I hope, is not a downer, but it is a downer if we don't step up. My message is we have a gift. We know what we need, and we could be great if we follow the right path. But we will suffer if we don't, and it's we, all of us, who will suffer. Just take again the demographic shift and what's going on that you've heard about twice. Here's some data for you to ponder. At the moment, 80% of those in this country who are over 65 are white, and 46.5% of those who are 18 and under are of color. This is a huge divide. It looks like a generational divide, and it is. Our racial divide in this nation has become a generational divide. Our inability to step up and deal with issues of race and difference and invest accordingly is now placing all young people in jeopardy. A couple of examples. Young white family moves to an urban area and they'd like to send their children to public schools. They will be disappointed, because the community they have entered has disinvested in those public schools. So it doesn't matter that the children are white, they still are feeling the burden of this generational divide. A young white worker moves to town, not making much money in the beginning, wants to save money by using public transportation. Very likely, that young white worker will be disappointed because he's entering a place where there's been underinvestment in a public transit system. We haven't cared, we haven't invested in making sure that everybody could partake of all the opportunities throughout the region. We have gotten to a point that if we don't step up, reverse the trend, and reverse our attitude, we all are going to suffer. The good news is the pathway is clear, the models are out there, the strategies are apparent. If we just could build the political will to be able to accept the gift that once again this nation is getting. Thank you.
There's a lot of brain power in this room, even if people have to get to classes or back to work. And it's my invitation to all of you to please pass questions and cards to the aisles. They will be collected. Dean Edley will begin with some questions we've received off of the internet over the last 24, 48 hours, and he will pose them to our speakers. But we will get your questions answered as fast as we can. We have plenty of time.
And listen, by the way, I think that if there's some important themes that are developed in the cards that we don't get a chance to, we will try to figure out a way on the web to get our guests to offer some comments on your questions. I have several questions here that in one way or another engage the issue of the sustainability of this university's commitment to access and affordability in light of what's been happening with public support at the state level and in light of perceived threats at the federal level to Pell Grants and the like. So, for example, what do you think needs to be done to repair the social inequality, social opportunity role of public university education, and who should lead the way to fix the problem? What can we do to push for change? Will the California higher education system still be accessible to all eligible Californians, regardless of their income? How would you suggest public universities go about preserving access to opportunities during difficult financial times? So, any of the three of you willing to take on that problem? Governor Reich?
Look, the path of least resistance is unfortunately a path that most of us, I think if we were polled, and many in the state would not agree to, but it is the path of least resistance. It will be the path we are on unless we change course. And that path is toward basically University of Michigan. That is high fees, high tuitions, looking, acting, and spelling an awful lot like a private university. Some internal subsidies through tuitions or through fees for young people from the poorest families, but lower middle class, the so-called and what we used to call working class families and kids therefrom will not be able to afford it, and many poor families will not be able to afford it because they just can't fit into that, even that cross-subsidized fee structure. We will end up, unless we're careful, like any Ivy League university. And I don't know about you. I am a product in part of the Ivy League. I don't bear too many grudges against Harvard or Yale or Dartmouth. But we would be giving up something that they don't have, something very profound. There is more, not only racial and ethnic diversity here in the University of California system, but also economic diversity. And that economic diversity is not only good for society in terms of educating and providing avenues of upward mobility, it is also good for all of us. It's good for all of our students here to understand the interdependence and to gain the sense of connection that we do have as members of the same society. So, just to finish up, an excellent university like this will not lose its excellence. I don't think that's in the cards. But we may lose our economic diversity. And that's what would be the great shame.
I just want to add that it takes a movement to do what's right under these circumstances. And I just want to lift that up again, that when we think about what we need our public institutions to do, that we need to have access to higher education, that we must make sure that we're making a demand for it. We need to organize around it. We need to be working in our communities to help people understand what's going on. We need to have a political shift, and organizing for political power, organizing for civic power is an important element. And so I want to see us as a nation make sure that we're providing support for low-income students. I want to see universities demonstrating that they're making that commitment, but I also want to see the public rising up and saying, we want to have a fully inclusive society. We want to achieve equity, just and fair inclusion, and equity will not be achieved without a movement.
Yep. Peter, let me go to you, but also move the discussion, add this dimension, as we have several questions here asking concretely what can we do with respect to the politics of this problem in California, and given your long experience as an observer of California politics and political process, if you could also weave that into your answer.
It seems to me that, and I'm glad you asked because that was sort of what I was just going to say originally anyway. Right now, each of the major recipients of public funds basically campaigns for its own share of the pie. There's very little collaborative effort made by higher education, K-12, the parks people, to commonly, and the health industry, to commonly campaign for a bigger pie. And it seems to me, and one of the crucial mistakes that the University of California made before, I guess, most people here were here, was in the late 80s when President Gardner, at that point, made a separate piece with Governor Deukmejian about support for the university, and refused to take, and the university and the regents refused to take part in a campaign pushed very strongly by K-12 to remove or modify the then state spending limit, which was a serious limit, and under which the governor, then Deukmejian, had refunded $1 billion to taxpayers on the argument that we'd reached our spending limit. That resulted in K-12 then going it alone and producing Proposition 98, which locked up 40% or more of the state general fund for K-12. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it began to create all of these separate pots that were immune to legislative discretion. And it's, of course, gone on since for local government and all kinds of other things. It seems to me if we could reverse that trend and recreate a sense of common purpose among the major institutions in California, I think that would be a good step.
Now, there's several questions here. There's several questions here that really are looking for some advice that's as concrete as possible about what students, principally students, but students, staff, and faculty can do politically now. There's several questions that relate that to the Occupy Wall Street movement and whether there are any lessons from that that are applicable to forming our strategy around higher education access here in California. A lot of people here looking really for some specific suggestions about what they can do. There seems to be a broad embracing of the messages, both the critiques that you've offered, as well as the messages that you've offered. People want to know, what do I do?
Well, I would say one specific legislative goal could be a 2% surtax on incomes over $850,000 that would be applied solely to education in California. And that would generate not a huge amount of money, but it would generate substantial funds that could be utilized, and in Peter's, in the sense of what Peter had just said, not just for higher education, but really for education as a whole. It seems to me that what we can learn from the Occupy Wall Street movement is that the mere visible manifestation of a movement of people who are beginning to be organized around a common theme, and this theme being widening inequality and the injustice of that widening inequality, connected with the power that comes, unfortunately, from a lot of income and wealth at the top, power to reduce marginal income taxes at the top, is itself a moral message. It's not just an economic message, a moral message about the necessity of change. And education is the thing that almost everyone in the society believes in. Poll after poll shows that Americans, if they are asked, would you pay more for more equality of opportunity, for better access to education, Americans say yes. And again, this is a fundamentally, not an economic, but fundamentally a moral movement.
I agree with that completely. And I think what we have to do is win something. We have to win something. I'm very interested, curious, and excited about the Occupy Wall Street movement around the country and around the world. Last week I was in New York and spent a couple of hours at Occupy Wall Street to talk to the people who were there and try to identify what were the animating values. And they were very much the moral outrage about inequality and the aspiration to have a fully inclusive society with shared prosperity in which all can reach their full potential. That's really what they're about. I think that we have to tie those aspirations to some wins, some policy wins, some political wins. I was excited about the American Jobs Act. It would have been nice if the American people had organized around it and said, we must pass the American Jobs Act. We have to identify something and win. Take a piece of the American Jobs Act. Take the education budget. You're right. Everybody agrees that education is number one. It'll solve so many of our problems. If we could just say, we're willing to give up some things in California, but we must invest in education. If we became unified around that, that would be good. My concrete advice is pick something that is in the value stream that we're talking about here and stick with it till you win. It's surprising, the momentum that winning something can produce.
So let me press you on that, all three of you. Does that mean pick something, pursue it through demonstrations, through occupations, through trips to Sacramento, sit-ins in...
I think we begin by occupying...
Will make a difference in the political climate of
occupying deans' offices.
Yeah. 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 Somebody ought to be there. Yeah.
I think one of the things, and Angela Glover Blackwell touched on this, one of the things that gives me hope is that the generations, the younger generation, all over the country, and certainly in California, is much more progressive than my generation is, and on all kinds of issues. My generation, I think, is, and even people who are a lot younger than me, people who are over 60, tend to be uncomfortable with the new world that's growing up around them in general. I think my kids' generation is much more comfortable with that, much more comfortable with diversity, more comfortable with gay rights, more comfortable with a whole lot of social issues, and I think less uptight about, and more comfortable with immigration. I mean, I've asked students on this campus, how many of you are dating or are good friends with somebody of a different ethnicity, and a very large percentage of them will raise their hand. And I think that's something that would not have been true 40 or 50 years ago. So I see some hope for that. And obviously, we're also having some things are going on in California that we should be mindful for and that we could attach ourselves to. One is that with redistricting now and redistricting that is not going to be a partisan gerrymander, and with the top two primary, which I don't want to get into, but there's going to be a chance that we will, of course, because of the demographics, we will have many more Latinos in the electorate. I think the electorate will be look a little bit more like the population as a whole, which I think is a very good thing, and which is not now the case. And as I say, with redistricting in top two, we may get an electorate that is a little bit more sympathetic to some of the issues that we've been talking about.
The one thing I would say in terms of concretely, what do you do? I would not say to rush out and begin to occupy before you do the work of thinking about what your issue is going to be. We've had the Occupy, and they're occupying in 1,500 places around the world, so the spirit has caught on. What we need to do now is come up with very explicit things that need to happen. Organize that. Think about what it is. Think about where the leverage points are. Maybe it's Pell Grants to make sure that lower income students have access to higher education. Maybe it has to do with the budget of California and how much we're putting into K-12. Maybe it has to do with something happening in this very community that you see is inequitable. But I think the time now is to take the moral outrage that Occupy represents and tie it to direct things that force people to say, am I willing to pay more taxes? Am I willing to give up something? Am I willing to step forward and be an advocate? It's time to move from moral outrage to concrete proposals. Pick the ones that you want, think them through first, and then organize around them.
Go out and find politicians who are not afraid to use the T word.
We have a question here. There have been a number of cards that have come up with asking about the demographic gap in this room. And with all due respect to the administrators and distinguished scholars and staff who are here, the question could be boiled down to where are the students? I think that's an important question, so I want to put it on the table here. As an empiricist, I can't argue with that.
Show of hands first.
There was a request for show of hands. How many faculty members are here? I know many people have left, but nonetheless, how many students? Well, so staff.
How many staff?
So that's an important thing to understand about where we stand in terms of this format and this forum. Related to that is a question yes, it is a question, and I'm going to read it in its entirety to be true to its spirit. A forum is defined as an open discussion. Isn't it ironic that the forum advertised as a call to action set at the birthplace of the free speech movement does not allow audience members to speak, but rather asks them to sit passively, as their questions are filtered and prioritized by authority figures? And I thought that, we're not going to duck this question or we're not going to get anywhere here. The purpose of this conversation was to be real. So I'm going to invite my other deans colleagues up here to answer in the sense to explain why we chose the format we chose. And Jen, would you like to take a stab at that? Because we're interested in a real conversation here.
I think what we were aiming for is less a kind of unstructured conversation, but an opportunity to have a series of thoughtful talks and conversations and discussions about what are some pretty profound issues of the structure of our society, of the history of economic growth and the growth model that we have experienced in the post-war period and where we are now, the kind of politics of race and immigration that have been discussed and that shape our political landscape. And so I think our idea was to engender across the campus a series of discussions that could filter out of this room and think about not only the structure of the challenges that we're facing, but also what Angela is really talking about. how do we structure a movement that can actually change what's the current dynamic, and that can create results that we hold as very important in terms of higher education, but also collective goods much more generally. And so I think we want to see that discussion and the many discussions, hopefully, that will go on across campus over the course of the next few months as something that's generative and that can help guide us. I think that having different kinds of forums, different styles of interaction is great, and I think all of my colleagues, not just up here, but all of the deans, would welcome different kinds of discussions with students, with staff, with faculty that are much more free-form and much more open in terms of who's asking questions. So I'm hoping that captures some of what our thinking.
Okay, so my answer isn't as fancy. I'm just doing what I was told to do. And what that is the questions I'm posing are trying to kind of pull together what big clumps of people have expressed an interest in hearing our guests talk about. So the hope is that you'll be able to get something from what significant groups of people in the audience are interested in hearing, even if it's not your specific question being expressed by you personally. There are a couple of questions here about California's master plan, and I think this one captures kind of the center of gravity in them. The California master plan was meant to last for 15 years. It's now over 50 years old, and many of its assumptions are changed, have changed, whatever. Isn't it time for Master Plan 2.0? If so, how would that happen? And let me add, how might its content differ from Master Plan 1.0? Peter?
I think, and I was a very strong defender for many years of the master plan, and there were attempts to modify it in the legislature over time. But I think right now, I think if I were to rewrite it in broadest terms, I would try to break down the silos. I would create much stronger connections, particularly between the community colleges and the four-year institutions, to facilitate transfers, to facilitate interaction, to create some economies by developing common courses, lower division courses that would be accepted by all three segments, would guarantee more transfers, would make it more reliable so that when a student took a course in a community college, he knew that that would give him credit at UC or at CSU. So I think that would be my first approach. I would break down those very sharp divisions that were created 50 years ago.
Either of the... No, I don't have a comment on the master plan, but I like what you just said. I think that the community colleges are a great stepping stone into more education, and there ought to be more attention paid to making sure that students who are in community colleges are getting what they need, and if they're not going on to four-year institutions, we haven't paid nearly enough attention to those middle-skilled jobs. Several economists have really talked about how it's the middle-skilled jobs that are really going to be those that are going to be able to allow people to start to move into the middle class again. And yet we still have job training programs that are just training people for whatever without being specific about what's going on. So more attention in community colleges about making sure that people go from there to good jobs or higher education, and not just a holding ground. But it's a terrible thing, actually, that we are just sending people into community colleges without making sure that they're getting what they need there.
Can I focus this in on and ask Bob? I mean, you can. I wanted to ask you in a slightly more pointed way. A number of the questions circling around this have to do with the relevance of the education we're delivering for the new landscape you described in your talk. So maybe that's what you were going to do, is to amplify on that. But I think brings a different angle to this, is the education we're delivering and our conception of that output really the education we need for the socioeconomic and landscape that you've outlined so elegantly?
The answer clearly is no. Early childhood education, for example, very few areas of social science are as clear and unambiguous that the returns to individuals, to families, and to society of stimulating 0 through 5 children education, focusing on children at that age before they even get to school, the returns are huge, enormous. It's socially insane for us not to be investing largely in early childhood education. K through 12, we know a lot about K through 12. And unfortunately, we have found ourselves engaged in an acrimonious and meaningless discussion between people who style themselves educational reformers, who want more accountability for teachers, want more choice, more vouchers, more charter schools and so forth, and then people on the other side who simply want more money for education. Well, the answer obviously is we need more education reform of different sorts. We also need more money. It's not one or the other. Teachers do need to be more accountable. There do need to be more experiments in terms of different kinds of schools, but we've got to make sure that all schools measure up to a minimum standard. With regard to higher education, Peter is exactly right. We've got to make sure that there are many avenues for young people, including starting with the 11th grade, 11th and 12th grade, which is where we lose so many of our young people. They either drop out or they emotionally drop out, but if there are, and they've been tried around the country with some success, career academies, 11th and 12th grade, and community colleges, essentially 4 years of building a basic skill in a domain of knowledge in which you can go on and through on-the-job learning get a lot more skill. It's not as if there are no answers here. It's not as if we don't know. We do know it. The great frustration is we are not doing it. We're not doing it organizationally, and we're not doing it financially. There's not the political will to do it. A lot of people in this audience say, well, what should I do? I'll tell you something. I know, and I've spent a lot of my years, as has Chris and others here, in government and in Washington, and I know that there's, regardless of the quality of people you've got in government, nothing good happens unless people outside are mobilized and organized and energized to push the people inside to do the right thing. And so I want to urge all of you to get as politically, small p, active on this issue as you possibly can be.
Bob, I really like your point about the largely inane but heated argument about education policies and so forth. I'm catching a 4 o'clock plane to go to Washington to participate in that largely inane, pointless conversation because I'm co-chairing a National Commission on Educational Equity and Excellence, and I can tell you that at that level, this commission is wrestling with that problem of external political support for the opportunity agenda. We have a couple of questions here that are basically about access for the middle class in the future of public higher education. While the Pell Grant and Cal Grant programs have been instrumental in providing access to higher education for low-income families, what should be done to ensure that the middle class continues to have access to a UC education? Any thoughts about that? Does that go in the too hard box?
I don't want to go twice in a row, but I will. Look, we've got to rethink the financing of higher education completely. One idea that we should seriously consider is income contingent fee structures. Now, by that, I simply mean that instead of there being student loans or federal student loans or state student loans, anyone at a public institution should be able to attend free of charge as long as they agree that for the first 10 years of full-time work, they will be tithed, maybe it's 10% or maybe it's 15% of whatever they earn. And that will go back into a common pool, a fund that will continue to finance higher education. In other words, we want a system that is not going to burden young people with loans. It's not going to force young people to take jobs that are high paid rather than jobs they love or are socially useful. We want a system that really does depend for its financing on people once they are in the full-time workforce. And it seems to me that it would be appropriate. I'm not opposed to young investment bankers subsidizing young social workers.
That's an excellent suggestion. It's an excellent suggestion, and I just want to reframe us in terms of asking what it is the middle class needs, to actually acknowledge that the middle class and people who are working poor and near poor, they're all in the same boat. They're all in the same boat. So many people who are middle class today are barely middle class. It won't take much for them to slip into poverty. And that if we begin to solve these problems from the point of view of those who are most vulnerable, we solve them for everybody. The classic example that I use to make that point is Berkeley was really at the forefront of this, that when you move around Berkeley, but it's true all over the nation now, those cutouts in the sidewalk, they're there because of the advocacy of people in wheelchairs. They had rights to be able to have access to jobs, but those rights could not be realized until they redid the physical infrastructure to be able to accommodate them. Now, those cutouts in the sidewalks, how many times you've been pushing a stroller and been so happy it was there, pulling one of those suitcases, so happy it's there, or pulling a wagon or pushing a cart, that when we solve problems for those who are most vulnerable, we tend to solve them for everybody. When we solve problems for those at the top, we tend to solve problems only for those at the top. So when you think about the problems of the middle class, they're all part of the same, because the example that was just used would work for nearly everyone. It's an excellent example. There's something to Occupy Wall Street about.
There's another solution: tax the rich.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I just want to say for the record that the proposal that Bob Reich just outlined is the same as the proposal that he and Gene Sperling and I got Governor Michael Dukakis to put forward in the 1988 presidential campaign, and probably explains why Mike Dukakis was elected president. Don't you? This is the approach that he sketched is something that's used in some other countries, and you know, it would just be fabulous if we could do it, and we really ought to think about whether California alone, with some cooperation from the feds, could do it for the population within California, so that we don't have to propose the, so that we don't have to persuade the senators and congressmen from Oklahoma. You should do that. When do we have to start?
We're going to take a few more questions before we close. But before we do, I want to mention that this is intended to be the first of 4 fora on this theme and topic. Many of the questions that have come forward are around issues of education as a public good, are around questions of how do we mobilize the public as voters, as taxpayers. How do we understand what our public mission is? Those are all themes that we'll be addressing over the course of the year. So I just wanted to make clear that this is the beginning of a conversation. We thought of it as deep background, the socioeconomic and ethno-racial background of the challenges that are ahead. But so if your questions don't get answered in the next 5 to 10 minutes, know that we're going to be continuing.
Okay, well, there are 2 questions that I think are well represented by the following. I think it is apparent that our education costs have gone up partly due to the high demand. While most jobs do not need the educational capacity they seek for, they could afford to do so due to the high flux of non-technical college degree holders. Hence, one can point to the educational bubble, analogous to the housing bubble, to the educational bubble where students are not really in college to learn, but to get a degree to get a job. Isn't this a problem for public higher education?
Well,
so,
I mean, there's certainly, at all levels of the system, a great search for prestige, including by the institutions that compete for for ratings in the U.S. News ratings and manipulate their enrollment and their applications and everything else accordingly, that offer all kinds of inducements to attractive students with student unions and fancy swimming pools, and there's a whole lot of stuff that higher education spends its money on that it could usefully do away with if we were only talking about educating people and not basically entertaining them. Of course, there are people who go to college to get a degree and go to colleges and see colleges for the prestige of the place. So you'd rather go to Harvard than you would go to the state normal school, and that's always been the case. I don't know how you get around that. It's certainly true that still a lot of good jobs, or let's say this, a lot of creative people who start businesses often are not college graduates, and there's still a lot of data on that. But it's certainly true that more and more jobs require some kind of credential.
So let's close with these two somewhat related questions, or at least related in my twisted mind, and also ask each of you if you have anything to say by way of benediction for us. We have one person who is asking whether you think that organizing to get voting rights for the student representative on the Board of Regents for UC would be a powerful lever as a small step towards a larger strategy. Then the second point is the state contributes about 15% of the UC budget. Would it be to the benefit of the UCs to become private universities? Would alumni become more invested in supporting the university if that move were made? So there's both kind of politics, governance, building, constituency support for the university.
I don't have a lot to say on either question, but I just was struck by the one about the student voting, which made me think that there may be a student, but the student can't vote. I assume that's why the question comes.
The position is advisory.
That's right. So I assume that from listening to the question. And my immediate reaction is, it depends on whether or not that student is actually carrying forward an agenda that we're talking about here. Because just having a student vote won't change anything if that student isn't part of a student body that has moved to a point where it has an aspiration for what's needed. So I just have to come back to this notion of movement building, of getting engaged, of understanding the relationship between inclusion and policy, and what are the policies that lead to inclusion, and having debate about that, and the sense of holding people accountable for trying to take you somewhere. Voting or not voting is never the issue so much as how informed is the voter, how accountable is the voter, how much vision does the voter bring.
Angela, I second that. And let me just also say that the Board of Regents is not the place where ultimately the action is. We are in a state in which more of that state budget is going to prisons than into higher education. Many of the people who are in prisons are there for non-violent offenses. Why is it that we continue to lock people up and we are financing, as a state, fewer and fewer kids who need help in financing higher education? There's something fundamentally wrong here, financially, economically, and morally. And that inquiry and that change has got to start right here at UC Berkeley. We are the best institution of public higher education in the world. If it doesn't start here, it's not going to start anywhere.
I go along with that. I also think we've been talking a lot about UC and about regions, and all of that is relevant. But keep in mind that 3/4 of our students are in community colleges, and an overwhelming proportion of students of color are in community colleges. So if you're thinking about equity, or you're thinking about success or moving people up, that ought to be the focus as much as UC.
Thank you all for those comments, and I want to remind you that the next fora will be on the theme of taxation and citizenship, another critical question, and certainly that was introduced today. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you for all of your thoughtful questions, and we hope to see you here in early December. More information will be forthcoming about that event. I couldn't agree with Bob more. The answer begins here, and if not here, there is no answer. So work with us.